Hey everyone, I'm Alicia McClintic here with my co-host Benjamin Cremer. Welcome to the A Plain Account Weekly Podcast. We are going to open up the Gospel of Luke and to see what the Gospel passage has to say to us this week. Sorry we missed last week, and we hope you all had a lovely All Saints Day. Ben, did you celebrate with your community in any particular way?
We did. We typically acknowledge those who have passed this last year from our community and celebrate the hope we have in the resurrection of the dead, and give an opportunity for those who may not have had as public of a grieving process as they may have liked, to at least speak the names of those who have been important to them that have passed in recent history. So that's kind of what we were doing this last week.
Oh gosh, that's really lovely. My community has had two very recent deaths that have really shaken us. So it was also an opportunity for us to speak those names and to grieve in a communal way, and to point to the ways that the church calendar offers us an opportunity to do that, not just once in these memorial services or our funeral services, but regularly on a yearly basis, as we remember the saints who have gone before us, and we speak of their legacy of faithfulness. And that's, I think, been on my mind as we come to our passage for today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Wow.
Shall we get to it?
Yeah, let's dive in.
We're in Luke chapter 20. The lectionary has given us verse 27 to 38, but I'm going to read all the way through 40. I just feel like it needs that ending a bit.
Okay.
So I'm reading from the NRSV today. Some Sadducees, those who say there is no resurrection, came to him, Jesus, and asked him a question. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a wife but no children, the man shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first married and died childless. Then the second and the third married her, and so in the same way, all 7 died childless. Finally, the woman also died. In the resurrection, therefore, whose wife will the woman be? For the 7 had married her. Jesus said to them, those who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy of a place in that age and in the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. Indeed, they cannot die anymore because they are like angels and are children of God, being children of the resurrection. And the fact that the dead are raised, Moses himself showed in the story about the bush, where he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now, he is God not of the dead, but of the living, for to him all of them are alive. Then some of the scribes answered, Teacher, you have spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him another question. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Whew. Thanks be to God. You're not running to break up your engagement with your fiance.
Well, thanks a lot for the podcast this week. I guess we'll see you next week.
Okay. We make jokes because we know that's not really what the passage is about. Right. Okay. But that does bring us to some really particular questions. If the passage isn't saying don't ever marry anyone ever again if you want to belong to the reign of God, which we don't think that that's what the passage is saying. So then what is it really about? What's really the exchange here, question and answer, really pointing to? And what are some of the ways that Jesus is trying to reframe a perspective here in this conversation? Because again, we don't think it's really about like, there's no such thing as marriage. Don't get married anymore.
Right.
So if that's not it, then what is happening then is our question.
I think that's such an excellent place to start. Because fundamentally, these verses start off with a very theological question. And much like in any society that humanity has ever lived in, it's how does our theology impact how we engage the world? All of the factors that go into political life, social life, economic life are if we really do believe what we say we believe, how does our theology impact the way that we live? And
totally.
And so we hear this kind of rare communication between the Sadducees, which we've seen Jesus sit at the table with the Pharisees, and maybe just for our frame of reference going forward to answer, to give some layers to this theological question. Sadducees only believe in the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and they saw the prophets and the Psalms and all those other books as kind of apocryphal, the way Protestants would read the Apocrypha in the Catholic Bible. And Pharisees had the whole canon of the Old Testament to work from, and therefore believed in the resurrection of the dead, and Sadducees did not. So that's kind of, I feel like, where we're thrown in the middle of this conversation between an ongoing feud. And as you mentioned before going live, Alicia, they had just thrown a question towards Jesus about taxes. So like we're talking of some big theological questions here on like how we say we believe and how does that impact our social life or public life together.
Totally. You are so good about always bringing us to these questions of theology and like embodied belief and practice. And then I think some of the questions I'm consistently bringing to our conversations is like, where are we in the whole story of God?
Mm-hmm,
so not only like, what do we believe and how is it lived out? How does it change the way that we are in a moment by moment, day to day living? And what is this story that we're zooming in on now? How does it fit into the big picture story of how God is moving all creation to new creation? So where do we land ourselves there? And here we have Jesus in the city of Jerusalem talking about civil authorities and powers, as he's talking about marriage and death and taxes and the ways that civil government has a role to play in our daily lives. But also remember, this is at the end of the gospel story, the narrative. Jesus has entered Jerusalem. So we've had the triumphal entry, we've had the cleansing of the temple, and Jesus is having these like really heated debates in the center of the city, really with like civil powers and authorities that be. So we kind of drop into a politically charged, religiously divisive, like chaotic space. Yeah. And we're listening to the ways that Jesus is reframing perspectives in kind of a drastic way, as these are like the last discourses of his life, where maybe we should remember when we read Jesus talking about the resurrection, that this is very soon not going to be a hypothetical for him, right? He's about to face execution. And so what we believe about the resurrection and the way that kind of comes to bear in this passage has real like personal consequences for Jesus.
Absolutely. And it's not one that is just a spiritual reality for him. It's one that he gives his very body over in death. So it's a very pertinent. And I think that might be when we read in our congregations, when we read this text of a first century very real political theological issue, this may come across our congregations like, why does this matter? Why are we even reading this text in church today? And I think it has very real world implications when we understand how important what we say we believe. If we truly believe what we say we believe, how should that impact our life together? And I think it would really help, I think, for our listeners to hear what maybe is implied here in this conversation about marriage. If we're talking about bodies and how what we believe impacts our bodies and the bodies of those around us, I get this really negative sense of a whole bunch of guys talking about how a woman's body should be used and legislated in this conversation of this silent hypothetical woman. Like, that seems to be such a factor in our world today still. So like, if we don't have to look far to see the real world implications in this text. Could you talk to us about a little bit about how marriage kind of worked in the first century and like what they're talking about legislatively in this passage, and maybe how it might apply enough for us to think.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Yeah. No. How icky! A bunch of old white
Seriously.
guys
Yeah.
deciding what to do about women's
Who
bodies.
will she be? Like, oh my gosh.
And no, it's not just who will she be. It's like who will she belong
Yeah.
to? Ew.
Who will she
Um,
belong to?
okay. Well, let me back that up a little bit and just talk about the ways that I think we've already pointed to the fact that the Sadducees, who don't believe in resurrection, really then as a natural consequence are committed to the laws of this current reality that help put into practice like real and tangible justice. If there is no resurrection and therefore no justice in the age to come, then what we do right now like is of the highest importance. Like, again, I don't think that the other contingent who does believe in resurrection doesn't think that what we do here and now matters. So not to say that, but that for the Sadducees, it seems to me that the best we can hope for is what we can get right now. And in that way, I think we can read a slightly more generous perspective into them as this like levirate marriage custom is meant to protect the woman who has been widowed and left childless, so without any social or cultural capital or any kind of resources or recourses to find a way or make a way in society. Really, the only option she has is to be married again. And so that sucks, but that's ancient culture. So the ways that the people of God kind of put into effect some laws to care for these women, because also, I mean, it's not that hard for us to imagine the ways that that an unmarried woman or a widow kind of has some stigma in the ancient culture, right? And so the way that the law kind of protects her and guarantees some justice and protection for her is to say that like this man's family is then responsible for providing like legal and social status for her, so she's not left abandoned. And so a bummer that she's treated like property and passed from one brother to the next, but it is the way that the ancient world was trying to effect some justice and protection. Wow. So I think we ought to maybe read some more kind of generous explanations into the Sadducees that are saying like, okay, we have this custom that's better than the worst, right? And probably better than some of the neighboring communities in the ancient world. That we can foresee a way to put a Band-Aid on this problematic reality.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. So I find that really interesting, and therefore Jesus's response becomes less about like, well, don't ever get married, but more about like an issue of this kind of the settling for, okay, well, it's not the worst that could happen. And Jesus saying there is a justice that's better and more than that. That in the age to come, in this hypothetical example, this woman won't be passed as property from one to another, that she enters the reign of God, the age to come, as herself. Like she's fully invited exactly as she is. That there isn't a need for her to be kind of brought under a patriarchal system. That she just gets to be included and part of the family of God. And I don't know, that I don't know how that resonates with you or how that lands with some of our listeners, but that's, I think, one of the ways that I'm coming to grips with Jesus's reframing of a pretty limited and patriarchal system of justice, and to say that like God's movement toward new creation, making all things new by the power of resurrection, is bigger than what we can imagine.
Right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
huge. That is, well, to go back to the layer that you gave us, like, this is such a very real conversation for Christ, because Christ is on the way to fulfill this mission of God in the world, with full faith and belief in the resurrection from the dead. He's giving his body over for the redemption of all the world. And as you mentioned, starting this conversation, it's not to say that like there won't be covenantal relationships in after the resurrection, that there won't be those who are covenanted and in relationship with one another, because we see that in the Garden of Genesis. We see
Right.
that humanity is created in the image of God, and the first proclamation over humanity is that they are created in the image of their Creator, and then they're joined together in this mutual edifying, harmonious relationship with dignity. And then it's only after the fall that we see this really damaging hierarchy get put into play here, and downplaying of bodies and legislation on top of those things. And it is contingent on the reality of death. So
Yes.
death is what starts that whole imbalance between God, humanity, and humanity with each other. And so if the resurrection is really a reality and is more powerful than death, then that theology should in fact change the way that we gather into these relationships, into these covenants here and now, if we are truly children of the resurrection.
Yes. And I think if we're going to appropriately reckon with the text and the story that's here, this like hypothetical argument presented to us in the narrative, I think we have to reckon with the issue of marriage. We have to reckon with the issue of resurrection. But I think all the time we come back to Jesus is always casting a vision of what God is up to in the world, that the reign of God is one of light and love and peace and justice, this shalom of all things made right and set right. And so I guess I'm consistently coming back to, what is that vision that Jesus is trying to impart, of a world characterized by like loving, mutual, whole and holy covenantal relationships. Like that sounds miraculous to me.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and I think that's what Jesus is pointing to when he says like people won't be given in marriage, right? People won't be treated as property given away to others.
Yeah.
For the sake of a patchwork justice system, but that in the new reality, everyone will be free, will be healed and whole to be able to participate in covenant, whole and holy relationships.
Yeah. Wow, that's powerful.
This is our hope.
This is our hope, right?
Our hope and resurrection, which then like cycles us back to, how then do we live here and now? How are we growing in wholeness and holiness and in covenantal, whole, healed relationships with
Yes.
God, with creation, with one another, like across the board? How are we growing in that space? We're doing that by the power of the resurrection and by keeping in step with the Spirit, by knowing that we follow a God who is in the business of making all things new.
Right. Yeah. Wow. I think that maybe frames for us what Christ talks about in regards to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think then that's the last thing that, if we're going to really reckon with this passage, we have to come to. Okay. So what's Jesus saying about our God is a God of the living? And then what's happening with that story about Moses in the bush and the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Like, what's going on there?
Because he's acknowledging, and maybe that harkens back to what you were talking about with legacy. Because at least in the NIV, he says, but in the account of the burning bush, even Moses, and he's calling back, like they said, well, Moses wrote this law. So he's kind of redefining how they should read the spirit of the law that Moses wrote. Even Moses showed that the dead rise. For he calls the Lord the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. For him, all are alive. And so God operates from this starting point of life. I don't think that's an eschatological proclamation that there are, people who are alive and dead still, whatever. I think it's more to the theological question at hand, that God is a God that starts and ends with life, doesn't start and end with death.
Right. Yeah. And that then, as people who belong to this God who starts and ends with life, how then are we contributing to, nurturing, facilitating life upon life upon life, right? Like how are we fueling a whole and holy life? I think also in regards to this question about marriage and children and this woman who's passed from brother to brother, it's not just about justice or protection for the women, but it does also very clearly seem to be about like legacy, or kind of carrying on a name, or bearing children, leaving a mark in the world. It seems very much about that too. So the marriage kind of children question is tied together, it seems, for the Sadducees in this passage, that it's not just like, how is the woman receiving justice, but also how is this man who has died without children being remembered, or not forgotten or carried on. I'm part of communities where Dia de los Muertos is a significant cultural celebration in ways where we remember people who have gone before us, our family, where it's very important to tell the story of our family, the people who have gone before us, that they are remembered, that as long as their names are spoken and their stories are told, they remain a part of us and who we're becoming. And it doesn't seem like that's far off, or kind of a cultural understanding or hope and fear kind of joined together here. And so as the Sadducees are asking this hypothetical question, well, what about legacy? What about remembrance? Because again, if they don't believe in the resurrection, then the only thing that matters is the ways that we're remembered by the living.
Right.
So then Jesus's response then is about, it's not about your nuclear family or the children which you have physically born or have been born in your name, but it is about belonging to the family of God. Like, your legacy is rooted and wrapped up in this God who begins and ends with life, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and also the God of Sarah and Rebecca and Leah and Rachel and all of these others, right? That your legacy is wrapped up in this God who begins and ends with life, who is making all things new, who is moving all creation to new creation, who is putting the world right. Like, and we tell those stories over and over again. And whenever we talk about the people of God, we also remember that that's us too, right? When we tell the stories of the communion of saints, like, that's us too, right? That's our legacy left in the world, which will, we believe, be the world that is forever, right? That God isn't given up on this world, that God is remaking this world. And so that as we belong to the community of God, our legacy is everlasting.
Yeah. Oh, amen. Amen to that. I think how I like, just processing what you've just said, it draws me to, like, man, understanding how we believe and what we believe and how that impacts the way we live. It just, in this conversation, Jesus could have used so many examples from just the Torah alone, the first 5 books. Like, if Abraham wouldn't have just relied on the legislation of his day, he had the legal right to sleep with Sarah's handmaiden, would, look at the repercussions from that decision. And did God like that? did God validate that? No, like God called that as sin because Abraham and Sarah were not relying on God to fulfill God's promise. They're like, oh, we've been given this promise. How then do we take it and make it our own and bring it to fulfillment ourselves? And it's like, no, why don't you just rely on God? And at the thrust of this, it just seems like that's what Jesus is calling for, is fidelity to the God who has given us life. And that we are alive in God through the power of the resurrection. And therefore we don't misuse bodies, because what I'm hearing and what you're saying, especially in regards to these two parties, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, give that two parties like arguing with each other. That's really interesting. I wonder if we have any examples of that in our world today. But they're arguing about that, and they're talking about like how much trust they should put in the religious structures and the political structures of their day, and that's kind of the cornerstone of their arguments. And on the one side, you can say, for the Sadducees, we need justice here and now, and so we have to rely on these very tangible real world things. And so they put so much trust in the empire and in the religious structures of the day. And I think we see that in our world today as well. The Pharisees relied on another sense of legalism in the religious institution, but really kind of an apathy in caring for the poor. Like, you don't see this justice of like the resurrection is a real reality. How do I live into that here and now? It's more like, well, resurrection's coming, so I'm just going to be faithful in my own righteousness to kind of inherit that,
Right. I think while we see the Sadducees really like clinging to the structures and institutional systems of justice that they can kind of eke out here and now, I think we see the Pharisees clinging to this personal piety. It's almost like a prosperity gospel. Like, if I do the right things, if I like participate in all the right rituals, if I know all of the right scriptures, if I pray 1,000,000 times a day, then God will bless me and I'll see some material blessings. And it's a kind of exchange system based on personal piety. If I am as like good as I can possibly be, then God will also be good to me. And we know that there is a lot more that's happening in the world, and in our complicated reality that doesn't fit into those two approaches. The like eke out justice here and now via the institutions, or a kind of ostrich head in the sand personal piety situation. And it seems like in all of these conversations, Jesus is inviting them into a different way way of imagining the world, and a different way of then embodying a response.
Wow, that's so good. This has been such a great conversation. There's so much more here, I feel like, and we've barely scratched the surface, I feel.
Yeah, I feel for the folks who are studying this passage to bring it to your people, because there just have been a lot of layers of historical context and literary context, and there's been a lot to understand to kind of get at the nuggets of truth. But it's just been such a fun conversation as we sort some of those things out and turn the passage over and hear what it might be saying to us today. And so that's always our hope and prayer, that as we lean into the text, we hear the word of God for us today. And so maybe as we conclude or draw to a close, are there any kind of central homiletical handles that you're holding on to as you come to this passage this week?
I think I'm going to focus on hope and patience. How does our theology impact our hope and patience? Because really, our eking out systems of justice or like personal piety, it's all kind of where we put our hope and how we patiently live that out. And in Stanley Hauerwas's commentary on this similar conversation in Matthew, he has this quote that has just always stuck with me. He's like, the disciples of Christ are marked by hope and patience. And you can't have one without the other. A people of hope threaten to seek after what they hope in with such ferocious haste that they destroy the world around them to obtain it. And that's kind of the Sadducees. And those who have patience with no hope threaten to leave the world just as they found it.
Mm.
And so this community of character, this community of the church, is one in which hope and patience are so married together, that we hope in the resurrection of the dead with such deep faithfulness that we have the patience to see and rely on trust in God as we actively live into that resurrection here and now. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where I'll try to land with some real world, like, how does our theology, and maybe get into a lot of trouble this Sunday, but how does our theology really impact the way that we live our lives out in our real world?
Yeah, that's so good. It reminds me of a quote from N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope, where he says, a people motivated by a people shaped by the resurrection are unstoppably motivated to work toward life here and now.
Amen.
He uses this like threefold frame of kind of acts of beauty, justice, and evangelism, that people shaped by the resurrection people are unstoppably motivated to participate in this new life through acts of beauty, justice, and evangelism. And so I think similarly, that's really where I land in the kind of swirling dynamics of this passage to say we are people of hope and patience. Patience isn't passive, neither is hope. But neither are either of these things strictly actions, right? But there's this spirit of hope and patience. It comes down to, what are we trusting in, and where is the work of God and the Spirit of God, and how are we naming that and attending to that, and partnering with where God is already at work, and leaning in, keeping step with the Spirit.
Yeah. Wow, that's so powerful. Hey, thanks so much for the integrity you bring to the text every week.
Ditto. Thanks for opening up the scriptures and asking some hard questions, and not letting me off the hook for answering some.
You can always count on me.
Yeah, and so it's always our prayer that these robust conversations are helpful for our listeners, and so we invite you all to continue to provide feedback for what you're thinking about and how you're bringing this text to your people. Let us know where you're heading for Advent. We would love to continue to make this podcast a helpful resource for you. We point you also to our website, A Plain Account, where there are several commentaries for the passages for this week, as well as some worship resources and other things. And so we would really, really love for you to utilize that in your congregations this week and this coming season. So I think with that, we'll say peace to you, preach boldly, and we'll see you next week.